Good morning. Stephanie Brewer, Director for Mexico with WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. Thank you for convening this important hearing. Mexico is a paradigmatic example of how policies that purport to respond to organized crime by violating human rights generate devastating consequences for victims and their families while failing to build security and the rule of law. When state agents operate by violating rights, the result is an institutional environment where authorities learn to routinely falsify information, hide their activities, and operate outside the law, all ingredients that foster corruption, further abuses, and lack of progress in reducing crime. Today, it's necessary to analyze Mexico's anti-crime policies not only from a human rights perspective, but in light of their broader effects on civil and military relations and on Mexico's democratic institutions, especially the judicial branch. Mexico's principal response to organized crime has been military deployment. This approach increased sharply with U.S. support during the presidency of Felipe Calderón, beginning in 2006 to 2012, in the framework of a war on crime that led to a dramatic increase in rights violations. Over the following decade and a half, annual homicides more than tripled, disappearances skyrocketed, and criminal groups fragmented and reconfigured, and Mexico's population has suffered the consequences. Military human rights violations have since fallen from the truly extreme numbers seen during the Calderón administration, but continue to occur. Current President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has deepened the military model, placing the civilian federal police with a militarized National Guard. The armed forces have seen dramatic budget increases despite their lack of transparency. And as mentioned, this occurs even as the military spies on human rights defenders, hides information regarding serious rights violations, and fails to comply with legal obligations, such as registering its arrests in the National Detention Registry. Moreover, militarization as a model fails to address Mexico's low rates of effective criminal investigations. Mexico cannot militarily deploy its way out of that problem. Violence occurs due to this climate of impunity and to collusion between state and non-state actors. State agents may work directly with organized crime, as in the context of the notorious enforced disappearance of the 43 Ayotzinapa students, in which security forces at different levels, both civilian and military, were found to be in collusion with criminal groups. At best, authorities may turn a blind eye to such groups' activities. A second tendency seen in Mexico are legal actions and discourse that seek to weaken the autonomy of the judicial branch. In 2019, Mexico increased the list of crimes under which defendants are placed in mandatory pretrial detention. That is, judges are stripped of their authority to decide who goes to prison while awaiting trial. This generates a perverse incentive for authorities to focus on increasing the number of people physically going to prison without necessarily having to build solid cases against them, and this in a country where arbitrary detentions and trials have long been endemic. In addition, López Obrador and members of his cabinet routinely tell the population that judges who rule against prosecutors are thereby generating impunity. In fact, the vast majority of impunity in Mexico occurs prior to cases ever coming before a judge. This climate of attacks on judicial autonomy only lowers the bar for criminal investigations and weakens judges' ability to protect human rights. A human rights-based response to crime must recognize that the state will be effective at combating crime by private actors to the extent that state agents themselves obey the law. It is vital that Mexico build capable, trustworthy, and sufficiently resourced civilian security and justice institutions. It is urgent to improve federal investigations, given that organized crime falls under federal jurisdiction. Investigators should prioritize patterns of violence that most affect the population, making use of intelligence, technology, and mapping of networks to construct evidence-based cases that can go to court, with a focus on dismantling criminal phenomena, not just arresting people in flagrante or prosecuting crimes like weapons possession one by one. Reducing availability of firearms, which flow largely from the United States, is crucial. Another key intervention point to weaken organized crime is reducing recruitment, as recent studies have highlighted. We recommend that U.S. cooperation focus on improving the work of civilian institutions and accountability for corrupt and rights-violating agents. Recent and ongoing areas of cooperation that should be prioritized include improving the operation of the criminal justice system, anti-corruption efforts, implementation of Mexico's laws against torture and disappearances, and forensic capacity. A human rights approach to cooperation also means raising concerns with relevant authorities and publicly about rights violations and the need for accountability for perpetrators. It's also essential to maintain human rights reporting requirements in security assistance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Adam Isacson. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Congressman Harris, for calling this hearing, for being here. It's an honor to be here with you today. I'm going to talk about Colombia, which today has a confusing array of armed and criminal groups. There's the Gulf Clan, there's the FARC, there's ex-FARC dissidents, I should say, there's the ELN, and there's many, many smaller regional ones. They run the drug trade. They degrade the environment. They facilitate migration, including through the Darien Gap. They kill thousands of people each year, including the world's highest numbers of murdered human rights and environmental defenders. They displace or confine hundreds of thousands each year. In 2016, Colombia's largest leftist guerrilla group, the FARC, signed a peace accord and demobilized. Guerrillas have disappeared from many areas. They're not around. They're not in the roads around Bogota anymore. They're not in the slums around Medellin anymore. But it's hard to find a place in Colombia that was under organized crime's influence 30 years ago that isn't under that same influence today. You know, the top leaders may have been jailed or extradited, that the group's names change, but organized crime is still active. Often, the groups can trace their DNA back to the cartels and paramilitaries of a generation ago. Why? Why is that? Why is organized crime so much harder to fight than the FARC was? My written testimony lists a few reasons, but most importantly, the FARC actually wanted to fight the government. Organized crime really prefers not to do that. Fighting the government is bad for business. Instead, organized crime thrives on its relationship with government. Corruption is the oxygen it breathes. My written testimony includes 10 alleged examples since 2022 of Colombian military and police who've colluded with organized crime. Criminals need police who will look the other way when a cocaine shipment is going downriver. They need mayors who go along when they traffic people or dig illegal gold mines out in the open. They need prosecutors who let cases die. This is a hard problem, but it's solvable. It's possible to protect people and institutions and to cut organized crime out of the picture permanently. The answer isn't send the military or declare a state of emergency and then just keep renewing it. In a phrase, the winning long-term strategy is government presence with low impunity. What does that mean? It means bringing the government into areas where there is none. And Colombia has a lot of those areas. There's rural towns and urban neighborhoods where people go years without seeing anybody from their government. Sometimes they can't even obtain the local currency, but they do see lots of armed actors. That's not enough on its own, though, because government can be corrupted. Just adding more of them could make things worse. State presence has to come with a justice system who can guarantee consequences for collusion. Prosecutors, judges, and investigators need personnel, protection, technology. It's important, too, to have strong, watchful social organizations and media. Now, Colombia does have many, many brave officials and social leaders who are trying to build this low impunity state presence and challenge organized crime. We need always to be asking, is the United States government firmly on those reformers' side, or does that support get squishy because of other interests like trade, drugs, migration, and China? So I pointed to a long-term solution, but it takes years to build state presence with a justice system. How can governments make people feel safer in the short term? How can they buy time? In Latin America, we've seen two kinds of short-term responses to organized crime: the mano dura, or the iron fist, or negotiations. In El Salvador, Nayib Bukele is using the mano dura with gangs right now, but at the beginning of his term, he tried negotiations. In Colombia, Gustavo Petro is negotiating. He calls the strategy total peace. Basically, it's offering talks, and for criminal groups, offering lighter punishments if they surrender and make amends to their victims. Just like mano dura, this raises human rights flags. Negotiations could end up giving light sentences to people who committed serious human rights abuses and have lots of victims. Some of these people already demobilized after earlier negotiations, and then they reneged on it. To justify taking a step like that, President Petro would need to show a dramatic improvement in security in the short term. So far, we're not seeing that. As Congressman McGovern mentioned, kidnappings are up, homicides are at last year's levels despite 2 ceasefires, killings of human rights defenders and social leaders are down only slightly. If total peace can work, though, it would make Colombians feel safer in the short term without mano dura's militarization and human rights abuse. It could buy time for a long-term government presence without impunity strategy to take root. If people feel safer, they'll be patient. But is there a long-term strategy? I'm not seeing it yet. I am seeing good intentions, goodwill. This year, the Petro government published new rights-based security and drug policies, but those are documents. In the first 16 months, the Petro government has lacked the managerial capacity to make them reality. Budgets are too low. Agency heads are inexperienced. Coordination is poor. Lines of command are unclear, and too often officials are learning about policies or personnel changes from the president's Twitter account. Polls show frustration with this improvisation and stagnation. It's not too late to fix this in Colombia. If it can get its managerial house in order, the Petro government could complement or could implement its short-term plan, Total Peace, and complement it with the longer-term low impunity governance plan promised by its new security and drug policy strategies and also promised really by the 2016 peace accord. Then Colombia could see historic progress because organized crime would have fewer vacuums to fill and fewer allies embedded in government. The Petro government isn't organized yet, though. The trajectory is uncertain. For now, Colombia's armed and criminal groups are not on the defensive yet. Civil society still is. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.